Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. The natural order has been restored. It's Friday night and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, it's been way too long.
Yeah, the natural order is back, Michael. It's like the restoration, you know? It's like when they got rid of the Commonwealth and Charles II was back. I wasn't a fan, Michael, but, you know, the experiment was over, so to say. And that experiment of us having a Friday show without both you and me, that's behind us. Let's look forward.
The monarchy has returned. I don't know. We don't speak about ourselves like that. That's strange. There were people in the comments. I did a few, as you know, a few sort of long interviews with economists on the Friday evenings. Everyone was saying, why have you benched Aaron Bastani? We want to see Aaron Bastani. Well, obviously, the reason I booked those economists on those Fridays is because Aaron had already booked them off. You see, you'd got the order wrong. We have a great show lined up for you today. We are going to be talking for actually quite a lot about the economy. Rachel Reeves has her long-awaited budget next week. We'll be discussing what she might do and some of the big debates raving on the left and elsewhere. I've also got an interview with Jayati Ghosh, co-author of the recent G20 Inequality Report. Nathan Gill, the former leader of Reform in Wales, has also been sentenced to 10 years in prison for accepting Russian bribes. I should be joined live by Carole Cadwalladr. We might end by talking about your party, some of their rows are continuing to rage on. If you'd like to support our work, of course, as ever, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. After weeks and months of speculation, we are in the final stretch before Rachel Reeves' long-awaited budget. And as the nation waits to find out who'll have to pay more tax, we know someone will. The government will have a keen eye on the response of the bond markets. As we saw with Liz Truss, movements in markets for government debt, can make or break a government. And this current Labour regime doesn't need any more headaches. That's the context in which the New Statesman magazine has gone to meet the bond vigilantes. They call them on their front cover this week, the traders who control the budget. It's an interesting piece. The journalist is Will Dunn, I think he's their business editor, spoke to fund managers in the city on what affects their decision to buy or sell UK debt. Obviously, when they want to buy the debt, it gets cheaper for the government to spend because it has to pay less interest. When they want to sell it, it gets more expensive. So this is what they told him, these people who seem to have so much power over our politics. After last year's general election was called, one hedge fund commissioned a detailed research on Labour. The fund wanted to know who Labour's MPs and ministers would be, what policies they would have, and how effectively they would deploy them. The research, according to a person familiar with the report, said, there is no plan, there is no vision, and they're not going to succeed because they don't have the talent. The fund decided to take a short position on UK gilts, effectively betting that Britain's borrowing costs would rise. They made a lot of money on that bet. He goes on, the Labour MP's rebellion over the government's welfare bill in July was further evidence for the market. When you've got a 168 majority and you can't get through some welfare spending cuts, one city strategist told me, the markets have concluded there's not a cat in hell's chance of bringing the fiscal side back. They pointed to the UK's £1.4 trillion in public sector pensions liabilities and the explosion in disability benefits for the under-30s as factors that would prevent investors from buying Britain's debt. The bond vigilantes aren't stupid, they told me. They're looking at this and saying, if your 405 MPs aren't willing to tackle this, then there's no hope for you. So they're not impressed. Obviously, these bond vigilantes, what they're trying to do is they're trying to guess how big will the deficit be in the future, how much demand will there be for this debt in the future, and what will inflation be in the future. That's sort of essentially what's going through their minds, and that's what they're looking at government to try and find out. Will Dunn also suggests the bond vigilantes aren't as keen as Starmer and Reeves would like you to think on them staying in post. So you remember last week, Number 10 said that Rebel MPs shouldn't topple Keir Starmer because the bond markets would revolt. So that was the reason to keep him in place. You might not like him, but if you get rid of him, the bond markets will cause havoc. Rachel Reeves also said something similar in an interview with LBC about her own future.
It's been suggested to me what you could do is you could say to the British people on budget day, look, things are really bad. The headwinds have been harder. The situation has been stronger, worse than I thought. Therefore, I have to raise income tax. But I promised you I wouldn't. So tomorrow, I'm going to resign as Chancellor of the Exchequer, having done the right thing. That would be I'm not going to behave like the last lot. I'm not going to play those games. I'm going to be honest and honourable.
And what do you think would happen in financial markets if I did that?
It depends who took over, I guess.
Oh, come on, Andrew. Look, I have been able to build a reputation that I can be trusted with the public finances.
What do you think would happen? How could the markets possibly trust an extreme left winger like Wes Streeting? It's got to be Rachel Reeves. She's the only one who can make those bankers believe that we are a soluble country, or a solvent country, I should say. One bit of evidence that has been used to say the bond markets are wedded to Reeves is that borrowing costs increased when the Chancellor cried in Parliament. I mean, remember, that was sort of after she had to do a U-turn on benefits cuts or disability cuts. Now, according to the bankers or the traders that spoke to Will Dunn, that's not actually the story. That's not why the markets went a bit funny after she shed some tears. He says about this situation, traders gathered below the TV screens, bewildered at the incompetence that led to the spectacle of the Chancellor in tears before the nation. Since then, the prevailing narrative has been that gilts were sold off as markets worried that Reeves was about to be replaced. Yet this is not what I was told that really happened. The impulse was not to sell off gilts, but not to trade at all, because they didn't know why the Chancellor was crying. All they had were rumours. As they refrained from trading, the liquidity, that's the number of buyers and sellers in the market, fell and prices became more volatile. The markets were not, in fact, protesting in Reeves's favour. They were simply holding their breath. So it wasn't them saying, oh my God, Reeves might go. Let's sell government debt because she's the only woman we trust. It's got to be Reeves and Starmer. They're the only people who can hold this thing together. No, they just stopped trading because they're like, we can't trade because we've got no idea. Why is she crying? What's going on? This is too confusing. I'm actually not that sure how much I buy this particular line, because the idea here is that it was too unpredictable and too volatile for them to trade. But I thought these guys trade a lot when it's unpredictable and volatile. But there we are. I suppose they didn't have any insider knowledge because no one knew why she was crying. So markets might not have Reeves's back. And a leading investor also this week told The Guardian that bond markets could force Rachel Reeves into a secondary budget if they aren't pleased with her first, which of course is next Wednesday. So they spoke to David Zan. He's head of European bonds at a company that manages $1.5 trillion in assets. So it's called Franklin Templeton, but I mean, I hadn't heard of it. You just need to know how much it manages. And he told reporters this: if Reeves is not going to tackle any of the big taxes, I don't see what she can do that the markets will go, fantastic, you fixed it, because she's not doing any spending cuts. If she had done income tax, I think markets would have taken that very well. It would have said, okay, we have somebody who's serious about getting the budget balanced. But that's not how they're thinking about this. Aaron, there's sort of lots of debate about this. Is it important for Labour to get the bond markets on side? Are they using them as an excuse? Or is this just an inevitable feature of any government? I was about to say any centre-left government, but also it mattered for a right-wing government as well under Liz Truss, that you do have to keep the bond traders in the City of London and in other global financial capitals happy and confident.
You don't necessarily have to keep them happy. You just have to not scare them. That's what you have to not do. The key thing is to not scare them. If you undergo an extensive program of national rejuvenation and you have to raise taxes and you have to borrow a little bit, you have to do a variety of things, and you don't petrify them, you're doing well. That's the main thing. You shouldn't be governing in order to appease the bond markets above everybody else. They're one stakeholder. You can't really piss them off like Liz Truss, otherwise you're basically finito. But of course, they matter. Jim Carville, a Democrat strategist, most well-known for his work with Bill Clinton in 1992, said famously, I once wanted to be reincarnated as maybe the Pope or a baseball superstar, but now I want to be reincarnated as the bond market. You get to frighten everybody. And there's an element of truth to that. So in regards to making excuses via the bond market, you hear it all the time. You hear it with Rachel Reeves now. Of course, you heard it with the Tory coalition in 2010. We can't do anything because we'll precipitate a debt crisis. Nonsense, of course, because UK debt to GDP ratio in 2010 was 60%. It's now 100%. Britain was not facing a debt crisis in 2010. The entire media, more or less, and most of the political class were lying to the electorate about even the possibility of that. So it's something that left, right, or for whatever reason, politicians like to make appeals to. We can't do this because of the bond market, but it is also a very real constraint. And it's certainly a constraint with regards to Labour. I do find it interesting that had Labour pursued increasing the basic rate, something which, of course, hasn't happened in the best part of 50 years. I think the last increase in the basic rate was under Jim Callaghan, the last Labour Prime Minister before Tony Blair in the 1970s, after Harold Wilson, of course. That was the last time the basic rate went up. Labour's plan was to increase the basic rate, very unpopular, of course, while also increasing, or decreasing rather, national insurance contributions for people of working age. And that basically would have left people on median incomes of working age at the same place. It would have raised, however, around £7 billion. That was a forecast anyway, from pensioners who, of course, have pensions coming in that aren't just state pensions, because you wouldn't be over the threshold with just the state pension, who had capital gains from various pensions, who had, or incomes rather from pensions, landlords who are declaring incomes, the very rich, etc. So that would have been a way of getting more money for the exchequer and actually not hitting working people, middle class people too. And that also would have been reassuring for the bond market. And when Labour announced that, some people have been on this show, Zach Polanski knocked it, etc. I didn't think it was necessarily a bad idea. If you're going to raise £8 billion and you're going to get landlords and wealthier pensioners and the rich to pay for it, sounds good to me. Of course, it's very politically unpopular to do that when you've campaigned on a no rise to income tax platform, which Labour famously did before the last general election. That's why they're not doing it. But I do find that really interesting, Michael. Labour could have done the right thing, made more money, or generated more revenues, not making money, generated more revenues, and they wouldn't have pissed off the bond market. But then the problem is the electorate. So they're in a real bind here. How do you solve the problem of good policy, reducing the deficit, not pissing off the bond market, not pissing off the electorate? You're trying to square a circle. And that takes us back to before the last general election, Michael, because the truth is, Labour in opposition didn't just lie to the electorate, they didn't just lie to their members, they lied to their own candidates. Labour parliamentary candidates, who are now Labour MPs, simply didn't think they would have to do things like vote through £5-10 billion worth of cuts to welfare. They didn't think that would happen. So now, when those things are put forward by the government, by Liz Kendall and Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, they can't get that legislation through, despite their majority, because those MPs won't have it. They didn't think that's what they would be needed to do. They were lied to as well. And that is critical. And it's something that, again, the media wasn't really talking about before the last general election. Labour need to mislead and say whatever they can to get into power, and then they can do X, Y, Z. No, the mistruth and the dishonesty about actually what their programme platform would look like, their dishonesty about the scale of the problems facing the country, is now constraining them in 2025 and 2026 and all the way through to the next general election. It was a major mistake. It was a major, major mistake to constrain themselves like they did. And people can say, well, they got that huge majority, bigger than anything Thatcher won. All true. I personally, if I was Keir Starmer, I would have preferred honesty and a majority of 70 and actually be able to get some stuff through than where they are now. Big mistake, and they're going to be paying for it all the way through to the next general election.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like they will. You said that there's no easy way to square this circle of sort of raising enough money without pissing off the electorate or breaking promises or sort of making life harder for working class people. Obviously, some people might say, well, there is. It's the wealth tax, and that has been the big demand from the left when it comes to this budget. And this week, the Patriotic Millionaires organised a protest in Westminster. And Brian Eno and Gary Stevenson both attended.
The first thing is you need to be looking at taxing wealth rather than income. People who work for their money pay already, in most cases, a very high level of tax. But families and individuals who have phenomenally high levels of wealth often pay almost nothing. I worked in the city, I made my money, I paid 50, 60, 70% if you include everything. And then the Duke of Westminster inherits 10 billion and pays nothing. So tax wealth, not work, is what I always say on my YouTube channel, Gary's Economics. But you need to design it carefully, which is why I'm always saying to the government, talk to me, bring me in, do the work. Let's plan a wealth tax that taxes the wealth fairly in a way that they cannot avoid. You cannot allow the richest people in your society to take a bigger and a bigger and a bigger share in economies with almost no growth and not expect ordinary families to get poorer. The reason that ordinary families and the government are getting poorer year after year is because of this massively increasing inequality.
So that's Gary's position. It's also Zach Polanski's position. Adichie Chakraborty at The Guardian, who actually we had on yesterday, really interesting interview with Helena. But he disagreed. So this was his Guardian column this week. What does the left want? A wealth tax. What will that accomplish? Very little. And he points out that in terms of raising money, the wealth tax, as it's being proposed, wouldn't actually be game-changing. So the Greens are proposing a 1% annual tax on wealth over £10 million. According to the Wealth Tax Commission, that would raise about £10 billion. People's sums on this differ slightly, but the Wealth Tax Commission was a very sort of credible source. And Adichie Chakraborty says, this isn't much of a policy, it's a pantomime of pseudo-radicalism in which the villains are some wankers on yachts and the solution is one simple trick, just like those dodgy internet ads used to offer. It just so happens it would yield about 1% of what the government spends in a year. So he's saying that if you got this 10 billion quid from taxing wealth, that's only going to increase government budgets by 1%. So it's not going to be a game changer. I suppose I've seen the figure sort of 24 billion bandied around. That would presumably be 2.4% then of government spending over a year. So not insignificant, but also not necessarily the answer to all of our problems. Adichie Chakraborty says that if we want to deal with wealth inequality, we might need to look towards a much larger pool of people. So basically middle-class people with houses in London. So anyone with a house more than £1 million, not just billionaires. Yeah. He also suggested we need to remember the Keynesian analysis, which was popular in the 2010s and encouraged the government to borrow to invest. Aaron, on this, I think the point about the wealth tax not solving everything is really important. Like you can't just say, oh, you don't need to make any cuts here. You can spend all of this money because we've got this wealth tax when it only will raise 10 billion to 20 billion per year. I'm actually in favour of broad-based tax rises on income tax. I know that might be unpopular. I think politically it's difficult because they ruled it out in the manifesto, but I would put 4p on everyone's income tax and then just have really good public services. We might talk about that a bit more in a moment. I suppose this point about borrowing to invest and why the debate has changed since the 2010s, I want to hear your thoughts on as well, because I had Steve Keane on last Friday and lots of people mentioning Richard Murphy in the comments. And lots of people are saying, why does this deficit stuff even matter? Let's just print the money. Let's just borrow the money. This whole discourse doesn't make any sense. I'm actually not that convinced by that because the 2010s, we had a real lack of demand. Inflation was just incredibly low. We were facing deflation. Interest rates were incredibly low. It was absolutely right that there was loads of capacity in the economy to do some Keynesian spending. It's less clear now, right? Inflation is 4%. It's not obvious there's lots of spare capacity. Unemployment is very low. And it is we should borrow to invest in like capital, but what the government are desperately trying to do at the moment is cover the bill for pensions and the NHS and benefits and things like that. And I think that probably does have to be paid for by taxes. What do you think, Aaron? Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I really agree. And it's going to be very unpopular, isn't it? I think that we should be reducing the threshold at which people start to pay tax. I would increase the basic rate. I would equalise capital gains tax with dividends tax. Ideally, you'd equalise both of them with income tax. And you know what? You do all that and you can do a wealth tax on top. Great. But the thing is, Michael, we're running now debt to GDP of 100%. That doesn't matter as much if all your bondholders are domestic like Japan, but we're not in that situation. We have 100 billion plus a year in terms of debt interest going on our public debt. Our deficit's £100 billion a year plus. Now, something like Richard Murphy said, it doesn't matter, you print my money. My view is you can do that if you're the United States because you're the global hegemon. Everybody has to buy dollars from you, right, to conduct global trade. That's America's privilege, with the dollar being the global reserve currency. I don't think that applies to the UK. We can disagree on that. I think Liz Truss shows quite obviously what happens if the bond markets get worried with regards to a country like the UK. We saw it as well with the Mitterrand government in France in the 1980s. So I agree with you that a wealth tax doesn't fix everything. I think if it raises 10 billion, great. But I feel like for some parts of the left, the wealth tax is a bit like immigration for the right. This country would be, milk and honey if we just got rid of all the immigrants. And I think it's a similar argument on the left. If we just have a wealth tax, everything's fine. We don't need to cut anything. I simply don't believe that's true. I think we need to get rid of a bunch of quangos, starting with the OBR, which makes all these terrible forecasts, which are always wrong. I think we really need to look at the administrative state. We need to look at things like Trident. Trident cost this country 100 billion plus. There was a report out earlier this week, Michael. Britain doesn't have the ability to defend itself from a foreign invasion. That was the line. It was in one of the papers, Telegraph or something. If Britain can't defend itself from a foreign invasion, what's the point of Trident? I thought the point of Trident was to stop a conventional war. So if you're now saying that Trident doesn't stop it, then why do we have it? These are the kinds of conversations we should be having, these huge bits of expenditure. Triple lock. I don't support the triple lock. I don't. This is new. The demand of the left after the 1980s, and Thatcher got rid of pensions being indexed to things like you can either index it to inflation or wages. That was gotten rid of by Thatcher in the 80s. The demand of the left was link it back to wages or link it back to inflation. I think either is sensible. What Cameron does in 2010 is he links it to either wages, inflation, or 2.5%, whichever is higher, which means you have a permanent transfer of wealth from the working age population to pensioners. Now, you might say, well, pensioner poverty is too high. By the way, pensioner poverty has fallen precipitously. It's now child poverty that's the problem. Pensioner poverty is too high. We have the poorest pensions in Europe. Now, we don't have great public pensions. It's true. State pensions. It's true. But we also have millions of people sitting on assets worth millions of pounds. And it's very, very strange that you have somebody who might be living in a £1.5 million house, paying very low council tax if they're in the right part of the country, because, of course, council tax is indexed to house values in 1991. And they've got a triple lock state pension. That is stupid, in my view. It's a complete misallocation of public resources. I think demand really matters. And I agree with Gary Stevenson on this, that inequality leads to underconsumption. Because, of course, people with less income have a higher marginal propensity to spend. If somebody's living on 20 grand a year and you give them £1,000 extra, they're going to spend that £1,000. If somebody's has a £1 million a year, they're less likely to spend that £1,000. And as Gary Stevenson rightly points out again and again, what they're going to do with additional income is to invest that in assets that will generate more income. So it becomes this recurrent feedback loop of more money for them means more assets, which means more rental incomes and more money and so on and so forth, which is just very, very bad for any country. It's not a good economic model. So Gary's right about that. And of course, inequality leading to problems of final demand, underconsumption. If you have smaller inequality, you're going to have more demand, right? And we want more demand in the economy. But I agree with you. The issue is not like in the early 2010s necessarily. We have big issues on supply as well. Energy prices are too high. If you want to be a manufacturer in the UK and you want to pay your workers, a great wage and you want to be a fantastic employer, you might be a co-op, ideally, right? Work your own business. Energy prices are too high for you to be able to compete with manufacturers in Europe, let alone elsewhere. So we have big problems on supply as well. Or if you're a town or a city with bad transport connectivity, there's a place near me, Gosport, I think it's 80,000 people. It doesn't have a train station. Good luck starting a business there. Gosport's problem necessarily is not demand, it's supply. Expensive energy, expensive transport costs. Very isolated economically and geographically. So I don't really agree with that. This is the thing we need to do. I agree with Gary that inequality is a major problem when it comes to demand. These two things are massively related. The right refuses to accept that. But I don't think a wealth tax is the only thing we need to do. I know he's not saying it's the only thing, but I don't think it's the panacea that's often kind of appealed to. We do need to think about what do we spend our money on in this country? What do we want to spend our money on? What's going to have a really high return on investment for the future? How is this country going to be a success story in 50, 100, 200 years' time? That's the mindset we need. That's the mindset China has, right? And that's what I would say can be something of a template for us. We don't have to do everything China does. It does loads of stupid things too, like the one-child policy. But it does really smart things, like being a long-term, vision-led engineering state. Britain can do that. We need cheaper energy. We need more engineers. We need more healthcare workers. We need better public transport. We need better housing, right? And those are the places we should be investing. And I don't just think, oh, well, we can keep it all the same and let's just have a wealth tax and it's all fine. And finally, Michael, we waste far too much money with rentierism in the public sector. Outsourcing and privatization costs us an immense amount of money. The idea that it would cost us money to get rid of that stuff is stupid. It costs us money. In the local authority where I live, it's about £120,000 to install a zebra crossing with lights. £120,000, a raised zebra crossing. Because you have a contract with an outsourcing firm over 30 years and they basically fleece you for everything. At the beginning, it sounds great. And as the contract proceeds, it's costing you more and more and it's really screwing you. So I think there's a ton of stuff that we need to do. And I think it makes sense for the left to be open and honest about that. And I do think just saying that, well, we can just print more money and have a wealth tax, in my view, and it's probably very unpopular with some people, is the left-wing version of when the right say, get rid of all the immigrants and everything will be fine. If life was that easy, I'd be the first to adopt it. I don't think that's correct, though.
Yeah, there are people in the comments thinking we're opposing a wealth tax and saying it's not just about funding government, it's also to reduce inequality. I'm in favour of a wealth tax.
Exactly.
I just think there's a limit to what it can achieve. And that's why I'm actually also in favour of raising income tax on all of us. Just a stat before we move on to our next story. So if you look at the average worker in the UK on income pays 29% tax, the average worker. In Sweden, the average worker pays 42%. In Denmark, 36%. So it's sort of those countries that have really, really good welfare states, everyone pays more tax. So I think the idea that sort of no one has to pay extra tax, we can just get this 1% off or 2% off super rich people every year is not going to fund a modern welfare state for 70 million people, which is where I stand, basically. And I think sort of like a government that isn't going to constantly going from one crisis to another is going to have to be honest with people about that. Let's go on to also on MMT. There was just a lot of comments on that saying, Michael, you had Steve Keen on last Friday and you still think that you need to tax to spend. Now, well, if anyone watched that closely, that was actually, I said in the interview, I agree with Steve Keen on private debt. I think private debt is really, really important. I think he's exactly right that we have too much private debt. It gets underplayed. People obsess about government debt, but not private debt, when actually that's just as damaging for economies and that's what creates crises. But in the second half of the interview, we talked about government debt, and that's the part I'm not convinced by. You can go back and check that out. We talk about it there. You can't say we don't platform MMT on this channel because we had an hour with someone who's in favour of that. But that doesn't mean I buy all of their arguments. World leaders are today gathering at the G20 in South Africa. It's the first time the summit has been held on the African continent, and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has used the opportunity to try and put the world's focus onto inequality. To that end, he commissioned a report by leading economists led by Joseph Stiglitz, which was published earlier this month.
It's not the laws of nature, the laws of economics that determine the degree of inequality in our society. It's the laws of man, the laws that we passed.
He and his team presented a range of solutions for world leaders.
People across the world know how extreme inequality undermines their dignity and chance for a better future.
One of the main recommendations from that report was to create an international panel to publish regular data on global inequality. So the idea is that this would be modelled on the IPCC, so that's the UN panel on climate change. And that recommendation was today endorsed by President Lula of Brazil, President Sanchez of Spain, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who you just saw there. So what would an international panel on inequality do? And is it a serious answer to growing global inequality? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Jayati Ghosh, Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and one of the 6 authors of the G20 Inequality Report, alongside Joseph Stiglitz.
We do recognize that inequality has reached a point where it's become an emergency in the sense of its implications. There's an extreme concentration of wealth and income at the top. There is a much greater impact of this, not just in terms of society and the injustice of it all, but because people are getting increasingly unhappy and fed up. And we're seeing this play out in many different ways, in social polarization, in instabilities and tensions, and in the youth who are feeling extremely unhappy with the way that things have turned out. We do therefore feel that governments have to do something about it. But to do something about it, you need much better information and data than we actually have. One of the things we found when we consulted widely is that while we have a wealth of new data, we don't really have enough that will be universally accepted, that is seen to be transparent and properly recorded. And we therefore need a panel that would monitor and actually formulate ideas about what can be done about this in a very systematic and technical way. So what we're proposing is a panel that is sort of similar to the International Panel on Climate Change, which is of disinterested, objective, evidence-based analysis that could provide very important information, not just to policymakers, but to people and to societies in general about the available state of inequality, the trends and the drivers, and the things that impact it, the processes that make it worse, the policies that can be adopted to make it better.
Does this suggest, because normally sort of when people use information or data about inequality, poverty, etc. They go to the World Bank, potentially the IMF, sometimes the OECD. You presumably think these organizations aren't doing a good enough job and something needs to take their place.
Well, no, on the contrary, the World Bank and the OECD are very much part of wanting to something like this. When we approached the World Bank and the OECD with this idea, they were also overwhelmingly positive because they recognize that there's lots of new information. There are parallel efforts to look at inequality. And therefore, what we really need is a sort of umbrella, a very small, lean organization that would bring all of this together in a cohesive manner and allow comparability and allow everyone to actually get access to the best available information in real time.
I love new sources of data and graphs about income projections. So I would personally be in favor of this. Let's talk about what we do currently know about inequality, because when this proposal was put forward, I think last week, I saw lots of people on Twitter saying, or X as it is now, sort of saying, well, actually, inequality has fallen since 2000. And there is one level in which that's true, isn't it? Because when you look at individual income, it's now less unequal than it was before 2000. That's a lot to do with the rise of China, but also Indonesia, Ethiopia. In general, it's the case that countries in the global south have had faster growth rates than countries in the global north. And therefore, we've seen some kind of convergence instead of divergence. So what's your response to that?
Well, there is a broad convergence, as I said, because of certain countries, particularly China. It's really driven by China, this fact of global inequality being lower than it was in 2000. But on the other hand, this has actually remained very high. The Gini is something like, 61, 62%. And it's reversed recently. In recent years, that positive trend has actually changed and it's worsening. But more than that, within country inequality is very high and increasing in most countries. What we find is that wealth inequality is significantly worse than income inequality, and that's been going up dramatically. That the incomes at the very top and the wealth at the very top has got more and more concentrated. So one important finding is that, in fact, since 2000, the top 1% of the global distribution has got 41% of the wealth increases, whereas the bottom 50% of the world has got only 1% of the wealth increases. So that is a very, very dramatic finding. And of course, wealth concentration also brings the concentration of power. And that is really what has added to the problem, because the extremely wealthy, and not just the top 1%, but the top 0.001%, have inordinate power and the ability to influence governments, to change regulations, to change laws, to change policies in their favor. And that adds to the general sense of powerlessness among most people and the general alienation and dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs.
A data point that everyone agrees with is that the richest people in the world, sort of that small group of ultra elite, are the richest people that have ever lived. Elon Musk being sort of the most obvious example, but there are a number of them. What kind of policies would you put forward to try and restrain the wealth and the power that comes with it of a character like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whoever?
Well, there are several strategies, and those relate to what we call pre-distribution, that is how the incomes and assets are distributed in the first place, and redistribution. So in terms of pre-distribution, there are many regulatory changes of the last few decades that have enabled such a crazy concentration of wealth. These include enabling certain large companies to garner larger and larger shares without proper competition policies that used to exist in the past. They include intellectual property regimes that enable companies to benefit from access to knowledge and control over knowledge in ways that are historically unprecedented. They include policies that enable companies to exercise excess control over a whole range of markets and also over various other resources, including now cyberspace, data, and the digital domain. In terms of redistribution, definitely we believe in taxing the ultra-wealthy as well as the very large companies, all of whom currently get away with paying lower taxes than ordinary people. In fact, the ultra-wealthy, some of whom you just mentioned, pay lower personal income taxes than most salaried people and most of their own workers. And the ultra large companies, the multinational companies in particular, are able to get away with paying much lower taxes than just domestically based or nationally based companies, because they can utilize the existing loopholes in laws, which can be changed quite easily to ensure that they pay at least the same as the rest of us.
Obviously, you're talking about global inequality here, and I can see very clearly how intellectual property, that's like an issue of global policy. It's written into lots of trade agreements and the like. Monopoly power and taxation are two issues that have generally been dealt with on a national scale. And it seems to me that no one's yet quite found a way to organise that on an international basis, which is why the ultra-wealthy are in such a strong position, because they can say, well, if you increase taxes on me, I'll move elsewhere. And then it's very difficult, for example, for the European Union to say we're upset about American monopolies, because it's ultimately the Americans that have the most power to break them up. So on those issues, monopoly and taxation, what are the options in terms of international policy that could try and, I suppose, restrain the super rich?
Well, in fact, in terms of taxation, the answers are now well known. And the OECD attempted for many years to hammer out an agreement with, what they call the base erosion and profit shifting inclusive process that they had brought in. There are basically two ideas. The central ideas are one, that you treat the multinational company as one company, not as separate companies in each country that they're based in, because it is that currently very outdated strategy that allows multinational companies to move shift their profits to the lowest tax jurisdictions or the no tax jurisdictions, which is what they do. Their profits are made in Europe, in Ireland, or in a country in the Caribbean, and where they essentially end up paying very low or no taxes. The way to resolve this is to say, well, you are one company with one global profit, and every country in which you operate has the chance to tax you their share of your global profits based on a formula of, let's say, sales, employment, and so on. Now, if you use that, then every country would be able to tax, let's say, Amazon or Apple or any one of those large global companies, their share of the global profits in accordance with what they are selling or the kinds of work employment they're generating in that particular country. To do that, you don't actually need an international agreement. It's desirable, but you don't actually need it. The reason that countries have found it difficult is because then that company can exercise enormous power vis-a-vis that individual country. And that's why global agreements, or at least plurilateral agreements, groups of countries can agree to do this and go ahead and do this.
If I'm understanding it correctly, you're talking about moving to a sort of revenue-based model of taxation. So it's the case at the moment that Apple can say, well, what's actually making the money is our intellectual property, which is housed in Ireland when it comes to the EU, where there's super low tax. So even though we're selling loads in Britain, the profit really is accruing to our company in Ireland. You're saying that they should be taxed based on their sales. So their sales in Britain, if it's 100 billion, or that's probably way out, isn't it? But 10 billion, whatever. Then you should be taxed on that amount.
Well, revenue plus employment is what I've suggested as the formula. But yes, digital services taxes are in fact turnover taxes on revenue, which are done on digital companies by several countries. The United States is actively lobbying and in fact trying to get trade deals with countries to prevent that from happening. But that is one option in a world where we haven't got the global agreement.
That was Professor Jayati Ghosh speaking to me earlier today. I did look it up afterwards. Apple's revenue last year in the UK was 5 billion or 4.7 billion. So I wasn't too far off with my 10 billion, just by, I suppose, 100% too high. The former leader of Reform UK in Wales has been sentenced to 10 years in prison for taking bribes to make pro-Russian statements in the European Parliament. Between December 2018 and July 2019, Nathan Gill received at least £30,000 from Oleg Voloshyna, that's a Ukrainian former MP with ties to the Kremlin. And prosecutors claimed Voloshyna provided Gill with the text of speeches which he read word for word in the European Parliament. This is a clip from one of those apparently scripted interventions in December 2018. There's also another segment from a speech in October 2019 here.
I have every sympathy with Ukraine when it comes to the Crimea, when it comes to Russian aggression and interference. But as surely as you can't fight fire with fire, it is wrong to fight repression with repression. We've seen activists and journalists alike being violently attacked by radicals with little, if any, reaction or protection from the Ukrainian government. This report rightly criticises the erosion of the freedom of the press in the Ukraine, and it is time for the Ukrainian government to take action rather than pay mere lip service. Ukraine's previous President Poroshenko tried to silence media that did not act as his mouthpiece. Using legal process, this was condemned and it failed. Ukraine has a new President, Zelensky, who is following in the same old, tired pattern.
What's interesting in that speech is that he framed them as being supported. I support Ukraine's independence, but in fact, the speeches were scripted by a Putin mouthpiece. To discuss the background to this case, I'm joined now, by someone who's been following it very closely, Carole Cadwalladr. What's Nathan Gill been found guilty of? First of all, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy, but
thanks for having me.
Give us the update. What has he been found guilty of? 10 years seems like an extraordinary amount of time.
10 and a half years, actually, to be precise about that. So Nathan Gill has pleaded guilty. So he pleaded guilty in September to 8 charges of bribery, and from a person who we now know was a Russian agent. And today's hearing was the sentencing hearing. So we heard the barrister for the Crown put forward a very, very detailed case about these 8 different charges. And then Gill's defence counsel spoke up and offered no defence, said that he felt enormous shame and that he realised how badly he'd let himself down, etc. And then we had heard from the judge and the sentencing. And in actually 10 and a half years is a long time, but each of these offences, so 8 of them, carried a maximum of 10 years each. So it could have actually been a lot longer.
Sort of to get my head around this, because I've heard of cash for questions, right? There was a big scandal in the 90s where there were business people paying Tory MPs to ask questions in Parliament. A huge scandal, but I don't think any of them went to prison. So is the reason why this is so illegal because it's a foreign power, and it's a foreign power who is, classed as an enemy of the UK? Is that why this was considered to be quite so serious?
I think it's because they updated the Bribery Act, actually. So these are all charges under the 2010 Bribery Act. And actually, one of the lawyers explained it to me afterwards, in that the bar is different, I think, from what it was back during the Cash for Questions time, in which it's literally, if there is now that you can see there is the intention to take money, that is sufficient bar for that to pass the threshold of being an offence. And then what happened is the judge, They then measure it according to 2 metrics, which is culpability, how guilty you are, and harm, like what is the damage done. And the judge, in her summing up, took very, very, very strong words about the gravity of this offence, the fact that he was a public official in high office, not even just in a national parliament, in a supranational parliament, that he had been a willing accomplice, that it had been sustained over time. There was a sort of whole list of things. And then the harm she spoke about in particular was the egregious nature of it, she said, was this absolute breach of trust with the public and the effect that has on sort of all other, politicians and institutions. So, it was, and actually one of the things she said before she sort of announced the sentence is, she said it had to be a stern punishment because it also had to act as a deterrent from anybody else who might consider something like this.
And Nigel Farage obviously is trying to distance himself from this guy, say he's just, a random guy, a bad apple, but he was head of Reform UK in Wales. It's not an insignificant position. Obviously, Reform now polling first in Wales. They weren't at the time when that Nathan Gill was in charge. What can we say about what this says about Nigel Farage? Obviously, there's no allegations that Nigel Farage took money from Russia to ask particular questions, but is it just embarrassing, or is there something more going on here?
No, there is a lot more going on here. And this is why this story has to be really sort of understood in its fullest context. So first of all, the Metropolitan Police gave a press conference yesterday, and they said very clearly that there are ongoing investigations. So this is not over. Nigel Farage, in his comments to the press, made it clear that he believed this is a case of one bad apple. Now, in the evidence that we heard in court today, it is very clear it is not one bad apple. It's a whole cartload of potential apples. There are at least 4 other British MEPs who are named in the WhatsApp exchanges that Gill had with Voloshin. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they're in any way guilty or that they took money, but it was certainly what we saw was that Gill was recruiting these British MEPs and a German and a French one into his sort of plan. And the second thing to say on that is that this wasn't just some random dude who was doing a bit of freelance corruption of, MEPs. The Voloshin, who was the handler of Gill, we kept on hearing in court how he was taking direct instructions from somebody who is very, very senior, this guy, Viktor Medvedchuk. And it was the judge who actually pointed out that Medvedchuk was not only Putin's closest ally in Ukraine, he was actually a good friend of Vladimir Putin. And at one point, they noted that there was also that they were talking about individuals in the Russian Federation who were being referenced in these texts. So it's a really high level operation, which is being run by these people very close to the Kremlin. We know there's at least 4 other politicians who are potentially implicated. There's no suggestion that they have taken any money. And then there is the really curious reference in the evidence to a leading figure in the party. So this was referenced, and then there was this really curious moment in the hearing in which, when Nathan Gill's barrister stood up to give his comments, to respond to the case. Remember, Nathan Gill is his client. It's his job to protect his best interests, as that is what he's paid to do. Yet the first thing the counsel said when they stood up was to talk about quelling speculation about this leading figure in reform, and how clear it was that there was no suggestion of impropriety by this leading figure. So that, very obviously he's referencing Farage there. And anyway, it was one of the moments in the hearing that really stood out, because he should have been standing up there defending his clients, and instead he was making his first comments were about the potential speculation about the involvement of this leading figure.
I suppose we should say Nigel Farage, of course, would deny all wrongdoing. As far as I know, the investigations aren't into Nigel Farage, as far as we understand, right. so far.
The Met Police were very clear about that yesterday. They said he hasn't been questioned. There's no suggestion on their part that he is involved.
Great. Just wanted to get that out of the way in case he's litigious.
Let's get that out of the way.
In terms of this being evidence of, I know you've been covering sort of what you think of as sort of like widespread Russian interference into democracy for a while. Lots of interesting reporting. I suppose there's one interpretation of this, which is that it doesn't seem particularly sophisticated, sort of paying a fringe MP a bunch of money to read out a speech in the European Parliament like that. That to me doesn't read necessarily as a really powerful conspiracy taking over democracy. It's almost quite basic, if you know what I mean. I wonder if your perspective is radically different to that.
No, I totally agree. I can absolutely understand where you're coming from, because, you've got to be, it's incredibly dumb to talk about taking cash payments from a Russian agent via WhatsApp. That is not smart or sophisticated behavior by anybody's measure. And I think I'd be surprised as anybody that it was as unsophisticated as that. I totally agree with you. However, I think there's several things going on here. One of which is that Voloshin is very clearly implicated in these high-level influence operations in Ukraine, which were absolutely very, very central to Russia's ambitions for the country, and that absolutely sort of paved the way for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's the first one. And the second one is that Voloshin was also very intimately entwined with the efforts in both 2016 and 2020 of Russia to subvert the two US presidential elections. And Voloshin was actually sanctioned by the US as a result of that. He was sanctioned by the EU, he was sanctioned by Britain, and he was indicted with high treason by Ukraine. So you can't just write this off as some sort of like freelance, bung some money to this guy over here. It's a whole web of influence, which was being very carefully stage managed. And you say, it doesn't seem to add up to much, saying some words in the European Parliament. But actually, that was very key because it looks really legitimate. And the big thing here was they were trying to make out that this station in Ukraine, with these very, very close connections to Putin, that were pumping out Russian propaganda. And the Ukrainian government were very, very disturbed by this and were trying to take action and creating this sort of miasma of actually this is a critical matter of press freedom through the likes of Gil were actually effective. Like that is what we can see from that. The efforts, the Ukrainian government's efforts to shut down this TV channel were thwarted, and that international response was part of it.
Carole, I know I've got to let you go because you've got a time constraint.
Can I tell you
but that's what I was going to say. Did you want to talk about that case that's going to the European Court?
Thanks, Michael. I would actually. So basically, I sort of co-founded this non-profit back in 2020 called The Citizens. And one of the sort of first things we did in 2020 was look at at the time there was this big kerfuffle because I don't know if you remember the Russia report, in that Boris Johnson had tried to stop it being published. Then eventually it was published in 2020. And the MPs from Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee stood up and said, it's absolutely vital now for our national security that we have an inquiry into foreign interference in the UK. And we understand what we need to do to strengthen our elections, because at the moment, what we can see is that they're not safe. Anyway, Boris Johnson refused to have that inquiry. And so we worked with a group of 6 MPs to take this case through the High Court to petition the government to have this inquiry. And that case, it went through the UK courts, it went through the European courts. It is now, and there's 3 MPs still involved, ex-MPs, Caroline Lucas, Alan Smith and Brian Bradshaw. Anyway, it's a really, really important case. It's now in the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. That's the equivalent of the Supreme Court for Europe. And it's been designated a case of significance for countries all across Europe. And they've acknowledged that this political interference from Russia has occurred in Britain. And they're now, the last sort of point of the case is whether the UK government has an obligation to investigate. So it's a really, really fascinating legal case. It's very important. It is, we'll be racing towards the next election in no time. And at the moment, there is gaping holes in UK law. So I just wanted to highlight that and follow The Citizens if you want more information about that. And just to say finally, all of this reporting that we've been doing about Nathan Gill is it's in our new news outlet, which I've set up with my former colleagues from The Guardian and Observer, called The Nerve. And we're at the nerve.news.
So people can check that out, the nerve.news. Thank you so much, Carole.
Inspired by you, Michael. Novara was one of the first insurgent media startups in Britain. We're taking a leaf out of the Novara book and trying to be a bit punk and setting up our own news organisation, which I don't know how you guys have done it, because it's quite hard, is my kind of verdict at this stage.
I think it takes a while. You know, it's not a short go. It can be a hard slog, but I think
What's your advice? Oh, Michael, tell us your top tips for setting up. If you're setting up your own news organisation, what are the top tips?
Patience. I'm going to go with. In terms of Russia's war on Ukraine, there have been some big developments in the past 24 hours. Donald Trump has put forward a 28-point peace plan. The deal would see Ukraine banned from NATO, Russia readmitted to the G8, and territory ceded by Ukraine. It's, of course, the issue of territory, which is seen as most difficult to stomach for Ukrainians. The 28-point plan, says that all of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea will be recognized as de facto Russian. Ukraine will have to withdraw troops from the areas of Donetsk that it still controls, which will become a demilitarized zone. In Kherson and Zaporizhia, the current line separating Ukrainian from Russian troops would be frozen. The deal would also ban NATO troops from operating within Ukraine, and it would set a limit on the size of Ukraine's army at 600,000 people, down from 800,000 now, although it had been around 250,000 personnel when the war started. So if the war were to end, you would expect the number of troops to decline anyway, so it'd still be a lot higher than it was before the war. Zelensky gave a 10-minute address to Ukrainians today, sort of on his perspective on the deal. Here's a key part.
Зараз один з найважчих моментів нашої історії.
This is one of the hardest moments in our history. The pressure on Ukraine today is among the heaviest we have ever faced. Currently, Ukraine may be facing an extremely difficult decision, either a loss of dignity or the risk of losing a key partner, either accepting a complicated list of 28 demands or enduring an extremely harsh winter, the harshest yet, with all the risks that follow. A life without freedom, without dignity, without justice, and all while being asked to trust someone who has already attacked us twice.
Aaron, this 28-point plan, I was reading Anatol Lieven, who we've had on the show a few times. He's actually saying, there might not be a better option on the table, so long as it allows, Ukraine might be allowed to join the EU with it. There's some money involved. But it is going to be a very difficult ask for a country that's been fighting this defensive war for 3 years to say it's going to give up land that it currently controls and it currently has, successfully fought for the past 3 years. I don't know what your initial take is on this 28-point plan from Donald Trump.
So Zelensky in 2022, 2023, 2024 has talked about the inviolability of Ukraine, which he's obviously entitled to do as a country, and that giving away territory, and this is something he really pressed upon in 2023 and 2024, giving away territory, including Crimea, was simply not up for debate. I think in 2023 he referred to it as a trap, but that's precisely what they're now looking at. And of course, a lot of this was predictable. That's not to criticize Zelensky, that's not to criticize the Ukrainian administration. They're in a hard place. I get it. But there is a question to be asked, Michael. Was it the right move to accept peace negotiations several years ago, which some allege were scotched by one Boris Johnson? I'm not necessarily saying that. We don't have all of the data and information around that because, of course, there is a fog of war. Accurate information is always very hard to ascertain under these conditions. But it's beyond any doubt that a similar deal, if not one that was slightly better, was put to the Ukrainians years ago and wasn't taken. And I think that is the question that Ukrainians should probably be posing to Zelensky once this is signed, sealed, and delivered, as it seemingly will be. Why do we have to have an inferior outcome to what was on the table while losing thousands of young men?
The argument made by Ukrainian guests who we've had on before is that option never really was on the table. It was always sort of a kind of pretend offer from Putin. As I say, I'm not. It seems difficult to ascertain exactly what was the case. That's just the perspective I've been given from Ukrainians on this. Of course, Ukrainians will disagree, by the way. Although, especially at the start of the war, they were very much in favour of fighting it. I mean, I suppose from the Anatol Lieven piece I was reading, that the argument he was making is that people who were saying this is giving Putin absolutely everything he wanted, that's not necessarily true, because obviously at the beginning of the war, what Vladimir Putin wanted was to take all of Ukraine, or at least to sort of have a puppet government in Ukraine. And by fighting back, which they have done very bravely, the Ukrainians have actually managed to sort of avoid that scenario. It will be a relatively small. Obviously, I'm sure Ukrainians would object to saying it's a small part of Ukraine which is being handed over, but it's not the half of Ukraine which at one point it looked like Putin was aiming for. And if you can get investment from the West, potentially join the EU, if you can have a sort of successful independent country in the territory which you still control and which you still have, that wouldn't be the worst outcome in the world. But obviously, I mean, it would be very, very hard to take. We'll wrap up there, Aaron, and we were going to talk about your party, but we've run out of time. And to be honest, we probably weren't going to add anything particularly new to that interminable debate. Thank you so much for joining me, Aaron. Great to have you back.
My pleasure, Michael. But I just want to quickly say on Ukraine, the red line was military neutrality. That was always the red line. And this idea that, they weren't really offers, but this one is somehow real. I mean, it's play for play, very, very similar. I just say one final thing, Michael, before our wonderful audience enjoy their weekend, going back to inequality. People say, why can't we be more like the Nordics? They're more egalitarian than we are. True. Per capita, they also have more billionaires than we do. Sweden, Norway, Finland and Denmark have more billionaires per capita than the UK. Food for thought.
Food for thought. And they have very high broad-based taxes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.